Welcome everybody to Labour 1, the first of the Labour sequence sessions. I'm John, and with me are Marta and Alice, who are providing some media support. A few logistical notes before we get started with the panel today. Hopefully you can see me change my slide. We are going to be having speakers present for 15 minutes each, and I'll provide each speaker a warning at the 5-minute mark so they don't go too much over time. And at the end, we've reserved 20 minutes at the end for a Q&A session. And that's an opportunity for people to ask questions, to clarify things made in the presentations, but also to start broader discussions about the research presented. We invite those kind of questions from the audience through the Zoom Q&A function, and we'll call on some people to ask their question live during the Q&A session at the end. If you'd prefer, I'm happy to read them out for you. Please just tag it Chair Read for me or something similar. And if the question is directed at a particular member of the panel, please also indicate on that on your question so that we know and can make sure it goes to the right person. This session is going to have something of a focus on families, women, young people, and inequality. And we'll be having further Labour sessions over the coming days, Labour 2 and Labour 3. So we hope you join us for those as well. So thank you. First up, we're going to have Pierre, I believe. So please feel free to share your screen now.
Okay, can everybody see this okay? Great. Well, I'm Pierre Biscaye. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of California, Berkeley. I'm excited to be here today and presenting my work on balancing work and childcare, evidence from COVID-19 school closures and reopenings in Kenya, which is joint with Dennis at UC Berkeley, soon to be at Oxford, and Utpap at the World Bank. So what's the motivation behind this project? There's a large literature on how childcare needs affect parents' labor supply, particularly women's labor supply, but this is largely focused on high-income countries. There's a growing evidence in low and middle-income countries, but there are a lot of limitations to this literature. Particularly, there's a lack of causal evidence from African settings and from rural populations in African settings. And this is important because there are a lot of different contextual factors in Africa that you might think might lead results from high-income countries to not really generalize to here. For example, larger households, greater participation in household farm work or household enterprise as opposed to wage employment, lower access to formal childcare, and particular interest today, the fact that in many of these settings, children play an important role as providers of household labor, for example, caring for younger siblings or working on the household farm. So they're not just recipients of childcare. And this matters in the context of the recent school closures globally as a response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which served as a major childcare shock. And again, as with the literature on childcare, there's been more of a focus for this on high-income countries as opposed to low-income countries, and particularly for the African context. So what we're going to be doing in this project is considering how school closures and reopenings in Kenya have served as a shock to access to formal childcare for school-age children, and looking at how this has affected both childcare burdens and household labor participation. So what are we doing in this context? We're looking at Kenya, where all the schools nationally closed on March 16th, a few days after the first COVID-19 case, and stayed closed for several months. What's really useful and what we're going to leverage in this context for identification is the fact that in October of 2020, classes resumed for only a subset of grades. Grades 4, 8, and 12 were invited to return sooner than the rest of students. And we're going to leverage that for identification, which I'll talk about soon. A nice thing about this as well is that while there were a lot of other policies changing at the time of the initial school closures, for example, lots of broad social and economic restrictions, the partial reopening was not accompanied by any similar policy changes. And what we're going to be doing is using data from the Kenya Rural Rapid Response Phone Survey, which was implemented by the World Bank together with the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, which implemented multiple rounds of phone surveys for a nationally representative data set. I should say nationally representative of households with phones, which is a little over 80% of households in Kenya. And the sample for this was drawn from a nationally representative survey that had been conducted in 2016 and supplemented by random digit dialing. So what happened during the school closures? Nearly all children of school age in the sample were in school prior to school closures in March of 2020. And while schools were closed, pretty much all these children were staying at home and generally with a parent. So you can think of this as being a pretty big shock to what parents are able to expect in terms of where their children are going to be during the day. They're not in school anymore, they're at home. and they're under their parents' care. Hardly anyone is staying outside the home. A few of them are at work with a parent, but nearly no kids are staying anywhere besides the home. And this has implications for households' childcare burdens. And you can see in this panel here, this is a change in the respondents' reported childcare hours over the past week as school closures policies changed. During school closures, women went from doing about 40 hours a week of childcare to doing about 55, so 15 to 20 hour increase in childcare hours during the school closure period, whereas men increased their childcare hours by between 5 to 10 hours. So both men and women are increasing their childcare during the school closures period relative to what they were providing before. Another thing that's striking about this figure is that while women are bearing the majority of the responsibility for childcare, men are also providing quite a lot of childcare and perhaps a bit more than we would have anticipated. And this has implications for what the impacts on labor are going to be. This figure over here is saying a bit more about how childcare responsibilities are distributed within the household. We can see that one thing that's really important to note is that there seem to be pretty important economies of scale in childcare provision. The respondents' childcare hours hardly change at all with the number of household children. This suggests that once you have 1 or 2 children that you're caring for, you can care for an additional child with the same amount of time, the same amount of attention, as opposed to having to care for each child in a separate time allocation. Another thing that's leading to these economies of scale is the role of household children in providing childcare. You can see that in households with 2 or more children, these children are together providing around 15 to 20 hours of care per week for their younger siblings. And then critically, there's almost no role of non-household members in childcare provision. In this sample, there's very, very low use of things like daycare centers or nannies or things like that. Most households aren't using any at all. So what are we doing for identification? We're looking at the partial school reopening on October 12th of 2020. Children in grades 4, 8, and 12 were eligible to return to school, and nearly all of them did. We're going to focus on children in grades 4 or 8 because the children in grades 12 are somewhat older and perhaps less comparable to the rest of the children. And we're going to compare households with children that were enrolled in these grades to households with children in adjacent grades, who the only difference between them is going to be that their child is 1 grade higher or lower relative to households whose children were eligible to go back to school. And we'll separate out children in mixed households where they have children in both sets of grades and look at those separately, particularly given those things about economies of scale. It might not make that big of a difference when only one of the children in that age range is returning to school as opposed to all the children in that age range or none of the children in that age range. And again, we're thinking about this as a shock to formal care availability for school-age children. And this is going to have, based on what we've seen before, different effects on households depending on the role of the returning student in household productive activities, so in providing sibling childcare in particular. So we're doing a basic difference in differences analysis, comparing households before and after the partial school reopening across households that did and did not have children eligible for this reopening. We're going to include household fixed effects as well as county by month fixed effects to try to absorb some of the other things that might have been changing in the labor environment at this time. And then we'll test for heterogeneity by fully interacting this with certain individual and household characteristics. So what does this look like? This is just plotting the estimated effective treatment across time periods where we've modified this equation to split out the post period into different time periods. And we'll see that for both women and men, there's no differences between being in a household with children eligible to return to school as opposed to households with children not eligible to return to school in the period while all the schools were closed. And then once schools reopen, following this red bar, we don't see any change in work participation. This is just, did you do any work in the last 7 days? But we do see significant increases for both women and men in the number of hours that they worked in the last 7 days. This is kind of formalized in this table here. We see no effects for being in the post-partial reopening period for control households. This is suggestive that there's not anything in general changing about the labor environment at this time. And we're also not seeing any changes for the mixed households. So households that had a child that was eligible to return to school as well as another child in a nearby grade. And again, this is consistent with what we saw about economies of scale in childcare. Having just one child return to school while another of a similar age remains at home is probably not going to change childcare responsibilities very meaningfully for adults in those households. And then for treatment households, consistent with what we just saw in those graphs, there's no significant effects on the extensive margin of labor participation. There's no change in being engaged in any work activities, either overall or by sector. But there are significant changes in the number of hours that people are working. And it's driven in particular by an increase in hours spent in household agriculture in the last 7 days, which is about a 25% increase relative to the number of hours that were being put in prior to schools partially reopening. How does this look like across different types of households? As we hinted at in that graph, there's no difference between women and men in terms of the impact on their labor supply. And we're focusing here on total work hours. So this is where we see the most change. And I'll talk a little bit more about why this might be very shortly. Consistent with what we would expect with the effect being driven by agriculture, we see a significant difference by whether the household is engaged in household agriculture, no effect in households that are not. Somewhat surprisingly, no difference between rural and urban households. The definition of urban in this data set is somewhat fluid. It includes a lot of actually agricultural households in kind of peri-urban areas, so that might be muddling the difference a little bit. Households below the mean of household wealth, when I'm measuring wealth as an index based on household assets, there's much larger effects in households with below mean wealth. These households are more engaged in agriculture, which might be driving part of this, and they also may have fewer resources to cope with some of these changes in household childcare needs. Consistent with this story about sibling childcare provision, we see much larger effects in households without young children below school age than in households with children below school age. And one of the reasons for this is going to be that when a child returns to school, they're not just reducing the childcare needs that they have themselves, but they're also reducing the amount of childcare that they can provide to their siblings. And this is going to be particularly important in households with very young children. So in households with these young children, older siblings are going to be important for reducing the burden on their parents. So if they go back to school, they're not providing that care anymore, so parents aren't really going to benefit because they're losing that sibling childcare provision. Whereas in households without those young children, having a child go back to school is more likely to meaningfully reduce the childcare burden on parents. And then there's no difference by the number of household adults. So why is there no difference by sex? One of the reasons is that, as we saw when looking at the number of childcare hours, we see that both women and men contribute to childcare in this context, and both increased their childcare hours during school closures, which would suggest that both of them are going to benefit from any reduction in childcare hours, childcare responsibilities, when a child goes back to school. Another reason why we might see similar effects for both women and men is that there's essentially two offsetting mechanisms that are taking place here when a child goes back to school. There's a change in the net childcare burden, and there's also a change in child agricultural hours. So here the role of siblings as childcare providers matters, as I just mentioned. If there are young children in the household that the older sibling could have been providing care for, when that older sibling returns to school, they're not providing that care anymore. So the burden might actually increase on the adult caregiver when the child goes back to school. And then child participation in agriculture is also going to matter. The partial reopening period coincides with the main harvest season in Kenya, and children do play a role in a large share of households. So in this case, if a child goes back to school, they're less available to provide assistance to their household for the harvest. And so adults might be increasing their labor supply, partially to substitute for a decrease in the labor that's being provided by their children. So this table kind of formally looks into those mechanisms. We're first looking at respondent childcare hours and how those change as a response to treatment. Unfortunately, we don't have data on all households' childcare hours during the school closures period, only for the respondents. So this is kind of a rough proxy of how childcare responsibilities are changing. And we're seeing that there's not really any change on average with the partial reopening for treated households. And this is because of significant heterogeneity and whether there are young children present. So we've seen in these columns that in households that don't have any young children, their childcare hours are decreasing, not significantly. When households do have young children, if their child goes back to school, they're significantly increasing their childcare hours, which suggests that that child in grade 4 or 8 was significantly helping in the household to care for the younger siblings. They return to school, and then the adults have to pick up that slack. So rather than benefiting from a reduction in childcare responsibilities from the child going back to school, it's actually a net negative for them in terms of their childcare responsibilities. And the impact of this is much larger on women than for men. Women are much more responsible for the care for these youngest children than men are. So they're much more affected by these childcare changes. It's not as extreme, but the patterns are similar when looking at any children below the age of the children eligible to return to school. Looking then at changes in childcare hours, child agricultural hours, we see that in the treatment period after schools reopen, children are reducing their participation in household agriculture by around 1.5 hours per week. and it's a larger impact when we consider whether or not there are other young children around who could pick up the slack when this child goes back to school. And the size of this effect suggests that substitution for children's agricultural labor could explain around a quarter of the increase in adults' labor participation, with the rest likely being explained by these changes in childcare responsibilities. And the reason that this could suggest similar impacts of the partial reopening for men and for women is that women are again more responsive to these changes in childcare hours, men are more responsive to these changes in child agricultural hours. So to wrap up, these are some of the first nationally representative results for the impacts of childcare in an African lower middle income country setting. We're seeing large significant impacts, around 25% increases in labor hours, even for a shock that just affects one older child. We might assume that the effects would be even larger for shocks that affect younger children who are more demanding of childcare from their parents. And doing some simple back of the envelope calculations, we estimate that very conservatively, if school closures had a similar impact on households as these partial reopenings did in the opposite direction, school closures account for around 30% of the pandemic decrease in work hours in Kenya at a cost of around $3 billion US dollars, or 3% of Kenya's GDP. Talked already a bit about significant differences between women and men. And we're thinking that although this study is taking place in the context of a pandemic, it may generalize to other contexts now that there's kind of a new normal around schools being open again, but similar kinds of restrictions being in place around COVID health and safety. So again, continued relevance in terms of policy implications. There seem to be limited childcare options for many adults to deal with childcare burdens in this context. They're taking on more childcare hours themselves or putting more childcare hours on their children. Unpaid sibling childcare is a really important source for these households, but it does lead to burdens for these children. And so these both suggest that greater access to childcare in these contexts could have significant benefits both for adults in terms of their labor supply and for older children in terms of reducing their need to provide care for their younger siblings. And then a final implication is going to be that Kenya's agricultural season is going to be shifting relative to the school calendar, or rather the school calendar is going to be shifting relative to the agricultural cycle in Kenya. And this could have implications for parents' labor supply, production decisions, and children's school attendance as the timing of school relative to the timing of harvest changes over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierre. That was perfectly to time, which is very rare, so thank you for that. So next up we have Louise. And as always, please put any questions you have in the Q&A and we'll get to them as soon as possible.
Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good day, everyone. I'm going to be presenting some work I did at Brookings as part of a project on youth employment in Africa. And it was jointly with my colleague who was then at Brookings, Dhruv Gandhi, who's now at the World Bank. Let's see if I can get these slides going. It always takes a minute somehow. There we are. So my paper, if you download it, provides evidence on a standard set of labor force questions. And the key thing I think is we're benchmarking African employment outcomes against countries at similar income levels. And I think by doing that, we get a different story about Africa's progress, and I think a more optimistic one. So I'll just give you the highlights because I'm sure to run out of time, although I'm just setting my timer now. I think that the bottom line is I think the youth jobs issue may be overstated. The youth bulge peaked in 2001, and youth unemployment is not that high when compared to other regions. The real issue is underemployment, which is quite common in low-income countries. So that's also not that high compared to other regions. The past 2 decades of growth brought transformative economic development to Africa, and growth was not jobless, contrary to the current narrative. And there was transformation, and the share of labor in agriculture is much smaller when measured by hours worked, but there's tremendous heterogeneity. Not all countries made the same progress, and women lagged men. Now, I separated out the resource-rich countries at the lower middle income level because their employment picture is substantially different. And what you see is if you're not a resource-rich country, or if you're a very poor but resource-rich country, like Liberia, your employment structure compares very favorably with that in other regions when you control for income. So Africa's not really doing badly or behind, but Africa does have an overskilling and an underskilling problem. So this relates to the quality of skills and skill development that people are experiencing, as well as the shortage of secondary education. But the idea that there's a skill mismatch and there's skill shortages, I'm not persuaded of that either. Okay, so here's a graph you've probably seen before because I've used it quite a lot in my work about the youth bulge being overstated. And you see in 2001, that was the peak of Africa's youth bulge. Importantly, all other regions went through a youth bulge as well, and we didn't have a big crisis discussion about that, although Africa's youth bulge is declining much more slowly. This spaghetti graph shows you that there's a lot of heterogeneity ranging from South Africa down here, which is declining quite quickly, and Niger, which doesn't seem to be, won't be declining for some time. Now, importantly, Africa has a high rate of labor force participation, and a significant amount of that labor force participation is youth age 15 to 19. So about a third of youth age 15 to 19 are working already and completely out of school. Another large chunk are working in school, and another chunk are not working and out of school and doing childcare, as Pierre just explained to us. But note that the youth labor force participation declined substantially. And one reason for that is that as families get richer, they can allow youth to stay in school longer. So that's another element of the youth labor force challenge. It's declining. The labor force participation of youth is declining, especially younger youth. So it's not as much of a challenge as people think. Okay, I think I already went through this. Now, here's just some brief evidence on the fact that there's economic transformation in Africa. And you see between 2000 and 2018, in the share of GDP and the share of employment. This is, by the way, the share of employment. This is when people are asked to say their primary job, but you see the share of employment is declining in agriculture and growing in services and increasing a little bit in industry. And the output follows that as well. Okay, so now this is a little more detail on the sector of activity where people are working. And here, what you see is males and females are changing their sector of activity at different paces. Let me just explain what I mean by changing their sector of activity. It's not that all these people necessarily move to another sector. It's that new entrants are much less likely to be in agriculture than their parents. So that's it. These are sector shares, not actually people who move, right? And so what we see is that women are much less likely to get into industry, even in this upper middle income group. Let me explain a little bit about the groups. The upper middle income group, these data are labor force weighting, right? So it's not the simple average of everyone in the group. You can see who's in the group in my paper, but the main point is the UMIC group is really dominated by South Africa because they have such a big population and labor force. The lower middle income resource rich group is dominated by Nigeria for obvious reasons. They're the biggest, by population, the biggest country in the region. Now, we did not break out the resource rich low-income group because, as I said, countries like Liberia tend to, kind of look a bit like other poor countries, tend to look a bit like Burundi, really. But we did separate out the resource rich because they have a different pattern. Okay, so of the opportunities in other sectors, men seem to be grabbing them first. That's probably not surprising. Now, here is the comparison, the previous picture. And here I'm comparing with the rest of the world in each income group. And the important thing here is that, especially if you look at this middle group, African lower middle income, rest of the world lower middle income. And I have the resource rich in there because it's hard to find a comparative group resource rich lower middle income. But what you see is that actually Africa's changes look quite similar to the rest of the world. Okay, significantly less manufacturing in Africa, and you see that both in the lower middle income group and the low income group. But otherwise, you know, the changes look quite similar. Another one that surprised me is the construction. Construction is absorbing much more labor in the rest of Africa, and I think that's worthy of separate discussion, which I won't go into here. Now, here is the share of hours worked by type of employment. Now, this is based on some work we did, detailed work I did with EFAD rather, using seven low and lower middle income countries here. And so it's sort of representative of Africa, but definitely not representative of the UMix. But the important point is that while these data over here show a lot of people working in agriculture, these data show that even in rural areas, right? Even in rural areas, only 40% of the hours worked are actually on the farm. And for the total, it's about 34% of hours worked. So while you saw the total for Africa that I showed you before was about 50%, this, and that included the UMix, this one is showing a lot lower. So the idea that everyone's still working in agriculture by itself is not really correct. They're doing what's called pluri-activity. And I think the importance of this non-farm household enterprise is quite important. But you see in urban areas, almost half of the people in the labor force in low and lower middle income countries have wage employment, formal or informal. Okay, whoops, what happened? Yeah, okay, yep. Now, again, we're going to the gender breakdown. And this corresponds to the one that you saw before. And what you see is that it's really men who have grabbed wage employment as it increased. Now, that's especially true in the low-income countries. One reason might be what Pierre just presented. You know, women have a lot of childcare responsibilities, so they can't go outside of the home and grab wage employment. Now, this is any kind of wage employment, so it could be part-time casual. It's not farm, though. It's all non-farm. But it could be part of the year casual or something. But you see that, and actually even in South Africa, men are more likely to grab the wage opportunities than women. But this difference between low middle income countries and the resource rich, I think, is quite interesting, which is that women were able to grab a significant portion of the increase in wage employment in these lower middle income countries, but not really in the resource rich. That may have, I didn't explore that really. I don't have the data to do that. That may have to do with the type of employment exactly. It may have to do with a number of other factors, but I think that's also worthy of further discussion, whether it's sector or just lack of support for women to enter the labor force, lack of demand for wage labor, whatever. What we do know is that in lower middle income countries, the majority of this wage employment is public sector, which we would have thought would attract women would be able to get. Whereas in these countries, the lower middle income countries, non-resource rich, the majority of the wage employment is private sector. And that's also an important source of optimism about employment transformation. Of course, I should say all of this is pre-COVID. COVID changed all these pictures, but we're kind of optimistic we're going to get back somewhere near these pictures soon. Okay, now here again, I'm comparing Africa with the rest of the world. Now, you see, actually, when you compare Africa with the rest of the world, wage employment is low in the lower middle income countries. And the reason I focus on wage employment, right, is that that's an indication that employment is transforming out of sort of lower productivity household, farm, and firm production into potentially higher productivity employment in firms, even though some of this is informal employment and casual employment. Okay, so South Africa's lower middle income countries have a lower income than the rest of the, on average, than the rest of the world's lower income. If I only included the rest of the world's countries that are as poor as sub-Saharan Africa's lower income, I would only have like 2 countries, right, in this group, I think Afghanistan and Haiti or something. So, but this is essentially, if you were to control for income, real income, pretty good. And then the lower middle income countries, they're doing quite well. As I said, especially when you go over here and you look at the non-resource rich, you see there the non-resource rich are really, you know, right about where the rest of the world is in terms of lower middle income countries. And then of course, South Africa dominating the upper middle income country, they're doing better than the rest of the world. Okay, now let's talk about unemployment. Yeah, youth unemployment is higher. And that, but it's not that different from the rest of the world. Again, youth unemployment actually has this U-shaped pattern. There are many reasons for that. Part of it has to do with the education tends to lag transformation. So it's harder for the economy to absorb educated workers. There are other reasons too, why it declines. Again, you get better labor market institutions as countries get richer. But, you know, you see Africa is not really an outlier. I mean, there are a few outliers here and here, you know, this is either South Africa or Zimbabwe or something, but, you know, you basically have a similar pattern to the rest of the world. So Africa doesn't have a youth unemployment challenge that's different than the rest of the world. But of course, this is the underemployment, the hours related. And now I want to focus on whether Africa, another aspect of underemployment is you may be skilled, but not working in a job that allows you to use your skills. And here you see that there is a portion, right, of the workforce in Africa that reports that they don't feel that they have the skills to do their job. This is not what the firms report. This is what people report. And that's actually interestingly quite high in the UMIC, although that may, of course, reflect something about South Africa. And then the majority in the low income and lower middle income countries think they're matched, and a substantial portion of the labor of those working, right, in lower middle income countries say, listen, no, my skills are not being used on the job. Interestingly enough, a study by the World Bank conducted in 2013 in Kenya and Ghana showed that a lot of people with digital skills in 2013, they weren't being used. This began to change. This was like something with digital skills felt they weren't being used on the job. I think that would change, and that was in urban areas. I think that would change now, but still this overskilling is quite important. And it suggests that actually the economy, although it's transforming, it hasn't evolved to use all the skills that Africa has. And I think that's an important thing when we start discussing skill mismatch and what skills are needed.
Louise, you have about a minute left if you'd be able to wrap up.
Yeah. Okay. So here are my thoughts about which I think we've already seen. On the skilling, I show in the paper that there's high unemployment among educated youth. And so I think that deserves some thought. And then I think informal will be normal, but of course, there are these demographic headwinds. And I'm happy to discuss this further in the chat. Oh yeah, this is kind of the policy agenda. We can think about that too. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Louise. Next up, we have Andrew.
Hi, everyone. Great. Thank you. Sorry, going to start at the beginning. It's great to be here. I'm going to go through my slides quickly, and I'm going to start my watch. So this paper is about earnings inequality in South Africa, and I'm using tax and household data. And the paper was funded by UNU-wide. So we know a lot about inequality in South Africa. We know that it's really high. We know that a big chunk of inequality is generated in the labor market. And so in this research, I've focused on the labor market. It's inequality in earnings and not overall inequality. And this is at the individual level for people who are earning something and have a job, which as you know, is not a very large proportion of the South African population, but nevertheless an important contributor to overall inequality. So my 3 aims, I'm using a new source of household survey data to measure earnings inequality that hasn't been used. And the reason why I'm doing that is because another source of earnings data, the quarterly labor force survey, is unreliable. And I've shown that in previous work with Martin Wittenberg, and I'm drawing on some of his work in the analysis that I undertake. So inequality is a bad thing. Oh, I should say at the beginning, this has nothing to do with COVID. So all my analysis stops in 2019. Just thinking about the other papers that came before me and that are coming after me. So inequality is very high in South Africa. If we want to think about why and how we might do something about that, we should at least know something more about it and whether it's changing and how it's changing. And turns out that in itself is not a simple matter. And there's lots of research. I know some people think that South Africans spend too much time worrying about the quality of survey data, South African researchers, but this is true for other places also. So the US, for example, there's work worrying about the current population survey and how it can be used to measure inequality trends. And the same is true for the UK. Survey and tax data give quite different pictures of inequality. This paper by Berkhauser and co-authors says that if you look at the surveys, inequality is stable, but it's rising in tax data. And when you adjust the surveys for some of the problems, you get rising inequality in the survey data also. So most research on earnings inequality in South Africa has been done with household survey data. As I mentioned, earnings inequality is very high. It has been stable, but this hides a more complicated and interesting pattern, a bit like wage polarization debates in rich countries. So the bottom of the distribution's caught up to the middle, but the top's moved away from the middle. And that you don't see in something like looking at the Gini coefficient or variance of log earnings. And there has been a little bit of research on by Martin, looking at a sample of tax filers, comparing basically tax administrative data with survey data. So what am I doing going beyond this? Well, I'm using multiple years of survey data, and I'm using tax data that covers, in theory, almost all workers in tax registered firms. And I'll get to why that little in theory is there in a bit. So if you're using earnings data, microdata, you're probably going to get it from a data set that I helped to create. The survey is all done by CSAE, but myself, Martin, and David Lamb at Michigan have pushed them all together, harmonized them, and made them easily available for anyone who wants to jump in and use microdata for South Africa. There's another source of potential data that's been solidly ignored by, I think, everyone. It's publicly available for nearly 20 years. They have very similar questions to the other survey. And in fact, in many years, they use identical sets of primary sampling units, the small pieces of ground that you go and sample 10 households from. Stats South Africa samples 10 households from. So seems like a great source of data. One problem with the data that starts in 2010 is that it's imputed by Statistics South Africa in a way that, unfortunately, it seems no one there quite understands anymore. So there's no imputation flags in the data. You don't know what's imputed and what isn't. It seems to have got much worse since 2013, and it's generally pretty low quality. So I've shown that in some other research. I can talk about that if anyone wants to in a bit. So the tax data, they're called IRP5 certificates. Every tax registered firm is required to issue an employee with one of these certificates, whether they file income tax or not. So in theory, every employee that works in a tax registered firm who earns more than 2,000 Rand per year, that's around $10 a month. So pretty much everyone will be issued a certificate, and that data is being made available between as a result of some collaboration between SARS, the South African Revenue Service, the Ministry of Finance, and UNUWIDA. So I've been able to spend time in a secure data center using that data. And you can distinguish between labor income and other sources of income because different types of income have different source codes. Okay, so here's one problem. If you do your best to try and make sure these data sources are comparable, you want to get basically in the household surveys everyone who would appear in the tax data. And what you can see is that if we do our best, or I do my best to look for formal earners in the household surveys, there are way too many of them compared to the tax data. So that's a problem. I don't have a good solution for it. So you can imagine that there's kind of two problems. In my efforts to weed out informal people, I'm not doing a good enough job. And so these numbers should actually be lower, the red and the green. Or alternatively, there's actually potentially quite a large number of people who are not being issued tax certificates, even though they work in an informal firm. So these are, I didn't mention, these are the full tax records. There's no sampling here. So this is full tax records. And then these little dots here come from household surveys with about 30,000 households in each. So yeah. There's unit and item non-response in the survey data, so we have to worry about that. Unit non-response rates are about 87, sorry, response rates, that's horribly wrong. Response rates are about 87 to 93% in both these two surveys. There's no decline over time. The QLFS doesn't give us enough information because of these dodgy imputations to know what item non-response is. So people can say, I refuse to give you my earnings, or I don't know. Or if I'm answering for another member of the household, I don't know what their earnings is. And so what I do in the GHS is to undertake a simple linear regression imputation for people who refuse or say they don't know their earnings. And I don't touch the QLFS because I think imputing for people, some of whom have, and where others have already had their earnings imputed, doesn't necessarily make sense. So this just shows you the change, pretty dramatic change in response rates over time in the general household survey. So lowest, and was fairly low in the early years, only 6% of employed respondents either said don't know or refuse. By the end of the period, we've got 14% saying don't know and 10% refusing. So it's a quarter of the sample doesn't have earnings. And that's a worry. The refusals certainly are people higher up the earnings distribution disproportionately. Brackets are people who say, I don't want to tell you the amount, but I'm willing to say that I earn between 500 and 1,000 Rand a month. And so Stats South Africa improves the quality of the data in this case by getting people who wouldn't want to give an amount to give a bracket. Okay, so what do the trends over time look like when you compile all these two sources of data, PALMS, which is publicly available, and the general household survey, which I've compiled myself in the last few months. So the trends are pretty interesting, kind of what I was mentioning earlier. Things go in a very different direction if you look at PALMS. These are the quarterly labor force survey for this period. And very interestingly, in this period over here, between 2000 and 2008, they pretty much overlap the two surveys. And that's because, as I mentioned, they have the same sample. The questions are very similar. And in both cases, they're not imputed by Stats South Africa. And when we get to this point over here, 2010, suddenly this rogue imputation algorithm seems to give some strange answers as to what's happened. So kind of collapse in earnings at both the median and at the 10th percentile. It's not quite as dramatic up at the top, but it still doesn't look so great. And at the 75th percentile, it's also the QLFS is underestimating earnings relative to the GHS. So it's basically a motivation for why I'm using an alternative source of household survey data to then compare with the tax data. Yeah, I think I've said all of that. So I've just kept the scale the same, but I only have information on formal employment in the GHS from 2010. So that's the period I'm looking at. And then also the tax data only starts in 2010. So that's as far as I can go with that also. And what you can see when we look at the different percentiles is that, perhaps unsurprisingly for people who've thought about inequality or earnings and tax data versus survey data, that there is, it looks like there's substantial under counting of earnings. So just looking at the median, the tax data is saying people earn between 10 and 12,000 Rand a month in 2019 rands, whereas the GHS is saying 6,000. And if you'll remember the slides, it's not identical because this is only formal. Previously, I'm showing you all employment, but the QLFS is going to be even below the GHS. And the same is true at the upper percentiles. Again, fairly substantial. So the 75th percentile in the tax data is about the same as the 90th percentile in the survey data. And this is kind of dramatic compared to other places. So there's that Berkhauser paper that I mentioned kind of saying things actually look quite good until you get to the very top few percentiles, maybe top five, whereas I'm showing pretty dramatic differences across most of the distribution. So Martin Wittenberg has shown that before for the top 2,000 or 3,000 earners. So he got information on people who actually filed tax returns. But as I mentioned, this data that I'm using, it's got about 9,000 people issued tax certificates in each tax year. And you can also use this to look at inequality. So I've got percentile ratios. This is a decline in the 90th percentile to the 50th percentile ratio, and that declines both in the surveys and in the tax data, whereas sorry, I got that the wrong way around. This is the 50th to 10, so the bottom is catching up to the middle, and there doesn't seem to be any change in the top as a 90th percentile relative to the 50th percentile. If you look at variance of log earnings and Gini's, the levels are different. What about the trends? Well, it's a bit more difficult to say there. The Gini bounces around quite a lot, and we don't have as much data as I could. I haven't been able to go up to the secure data center since COVID happened, so I can't update this with the last few years, or haven't yet. So just to conclude, that was a bit of a rush through. I've got a new source of survey data that hasn't really been used at all to understand earnings, to examine trends in earnings over time. It seems to be much more sensible than the quarterly labor force survey, which has some severe problems as a result, I think, of the imputation methods that have been used by CSAE. That's really disappointing because the QLFS it's a labor focused survey. It's got a lot more questions that probably can get you much better estimate of the types of people that would appear in the SARS data when they're in the QLFS. So that's kind of disappointing. Trying to convince that South Africa to do away with imputation and just give us the unimputed data, but sadly for the last few years I haven't been successful in doing that. There does seem to be a substantial amount of underreporting, but we do have this problem of just the large number of the large difference in the number of formal earners in the survey, or estimated formal number of formal earners in the survey, and those with tax certificates. So that makes it a bit more difficult for me to be certain or satisfied that these are the true trends in earnings and inequality and differences between the tax data and the survey data, because we have all these extra people and where they might fit in, the 4 million extra GHS people, where we might chuck them out from, and where perhaps people are not being given tax certificates even though they're working for formal firms. That's kind of difficult to say. So it's interesting that the trends in earnings inequality are not that different, although it'd be nice to have a few more years of data to be able to say something more substantive about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Next up, we have Diva.
Hi, everybody. Just give me 1 second while I pull this up. Can you see my screen? Hi, I'm presenting my PhD paper on our working women penalized in the marriage market in India. I'm just going to quickly go over the context and the lit review, the design of the study, the results, the limitations, and the conclusion. Some of you may be familiar with this Netflix show that went viral a couple of years ago called Indian Matchmaking, which is what the paper is named after. And it was very popular both in the US and India. And there's this formidable matchmaker who says things like, if the females are lawyers in India, people are scared. The idea is to really test what the marriage market looks like for women who have worked or want to work after marriage. We know from survey data that India is very much on the conservative side compared to many other countries when it comes to thinking about women's work. So as you can see, India is on the red side, and it's one of the countries that is most conservative in terms of views on gender roles for women. It also has one of the lowest female labor force participation rates globally. It's currently around 23%, though that is a pre-COVID number. And there's growing evidence that, despite increasing education, infrastructure in terms of like water or roads, for example, dropping fertility rates, labor force participation has been falling. And this could be partly attributable. There are many other interlinked factors, but this could be partly driven by restrictive gender norms, which can hinder women's ability and incentives to work. It's well documented, as I was showing earlier, that views are fairly conservative. Almost half of adult men and women report that married women whose husbands earn well should not work outside the home. We also know from a broader literature outside of India that women, sort of signal based on men's preferences, and that may constrain them from joining, from staying, or excelling in the labor force. In many other countries where women have become increasingly more educated or gone on to work, you see shifts in marriage rates, but this is not something that's actually happened in India. So marriage is a near universal phenomenon. So almost 99% of women by the age of 40 get married. And so it's possible that women's choices to work are also being driven or influenced by marital incentives. So what I aim to look at in this paper is running an online experiment on India's most popular matrimonial website to look at a few types of questions. How does a woman's having ever worked affect the kind of interest she gets from male suitors in the marriage market? How does her intention to continue pursuing a career after marriage affect her outcomes in the marriage market? And does income make any difference? So as a working woman, does earning more than a male suitor affect these outcomes? I use an experimental design used in many other correspondence experiments and administer this on India's most popular matrimonial website called shadi.com, which has had about 35 million users since its inception. I basically use a sample of almost 2,750 male suitors within a few caste categories. And the reason for looking within castes is most marriage within India is caste-based and happens within castes. So I select these male suitors for 4 castes spread out slightly around the caste spectrum in and around Delhi, and have about 700 for each caste group, except for one where did not have sufficient sample, based on their meeting certain criteria, which includes income. So in response, what I do is I actually create marital profiles for women for each of these 4 castes, which are identical on all factors except for work and income. And then the selected male users in my sample are randomized to receive expressions of interest from one of the same caste profiles. So to give you a little bit more detail on how the profiles are set up for this experimental design, fabricated profiles are created for each caste. These are modeled on real profiles after user group consultations. And for each of these caste categories, I create nearly 5 identical profiles. So that's about 20 profiles overall on the marriage website for women. Now, these profiles are identical on a number of different factors. So age, height, skin, religion, mother tongue, education, lifestyle, horoscope, the kinds of questions you're asked in a typical marital profile, and they don't include any photos, since a photo could be a confounding factor. What I do vary on these profiles then is work and income. And the control profile is one of a woman who has never worked and does not intend to work after marriage. The first 2 treatments are women who want to work after marriage, one earning at a higher income and the second earning at a lower income, but both signaling their preference to continue working after marriage. The next 2 sets of profiles are those of women who did work before marriage, but make a stated preference to give this work up once they get married. And again, I vary with high and low income. So overall, I have about 5 profiles, as I was saying, and male suitors are randomly allocated to receive an expression of interest from one of these five arms, which vary across whether they worked before or after marriage or didn't work at all, and whether they earn more or less than the male suitor profiles. The primary outcome that I look at is response rates. So response rates from these male suitors are monitored over a period of 30 days to see how they respond and come back to these expressions of interest. There are 4 possible response options. The first is you can accept, you can request a photo, you can not respond, or you can decline the invite. I basically use the most conservative option of accepting and not accepting. So if you've signaled and accept, then I count that as an acceptance, but the results hold for other combinations as well. Previous studies do show that reported preferences are a good proxy for actual outcomes. So your response for interest may be a good proxy for what actual marriage outcomes look like. And I also look at use these profiles to cull data on socioeconomic characteristics of the male sample. So this includes education, their work, their family size, location, and who's operating their account. Overall, the sample is balanced, though there are a few things that stand out here and there, and the full details are in the paper. But what's interesting to see is that on average, these men are about 28 years old. About half of them have an undergraduate degree, and very, very few have a doctorate. So and sort of less than half, so about 40% have a postgraduate degree as well. Now, the main results of the paper are as follows. What I do see is that response rates are highest when we look at the mean response for women who have never worked. So the profiles where women signal not having worked before or after marriage receive the most interest. There's a significant drop for the next 2 profiles of women who want to work after marriage, though interestingly, the higher income women receive more interest than the ones who earn less. And that was not my hypothesis going in. The next set of women who did work before marriage and are not working after marriage don't seem to have a significant drop in interest compared to women who never worked. And this pans out as well in the analysis that follows. In my regressions, you see there's a 10 to 15 percentage point drop for women who want to work after marriage. And so this is about a 25% decrease compared to the women who have never worked. I also look at heterogeneity by caste, and for those of you who are familiar with the caste system in India, these results are actually quite interesting because amongst the castes that I have in the sample, and certainly that's 4 of many hundreds of castes and subcastes, but it's interesting to see that the results are being driven largely by higher caste groups. So within these castes, by the higher caste groups, which are associated with stricter, more stringent notions of pollution and purity for women. So a lot of this is also being driven potentially by caste-based notions. And then also trying to look at what are the kinds of men who want to marry women who work. Just using Logit, I find that these men tend to be slightly younger. They're also more likely to run their own accounts on the website rather than have a family member who is operating the account for them. They're also more likely to have a special diploma certification, though that's not very clear what that means because a range of things could qualify for diploma or certification. Other things don't seem to matter. So the sector of their work, their specialization, family size don't seem to explain the types of men who want to marry women who work. And then what I get to is to try and actually look at the kinds of channels that might be driving these results. So what are the mechanisms to explain the results that we see? Now, the sort of standard economic theory argument for the income channel would be that women who work bring more income to the household and should therefore be of greater preference to the men. The gender norms channel is just the opposite. It is the cost of not meeting gender norms around restrictive gender norms around women's work should explain why male suitors would not prefer a woman who worked. But there's also a third channel, which is a human capital development channel that has been discussed in the literature, which looks at the role of your partner, of your spouse, as also being a way to shape your children, so the future generation, in terms of transferring improved human capital development, and work is one form of that. And so this paper distinguishes between the 3 channels by looking across the treatment arms to understand what explains the results. I can see I'm running out of time because John has come on video. So I'll just leave you with the thought that the gender norms channel is what seems dominant, though because we see a higher preference, slightly higher preference for higher income women who want to work after marriage compared to lower income ones, there is a weak effect of the income. The human capital development channel doesn't pan out because at the time of marriage, the women who wanted to work, who are working, are all equivalent in their human capital development channel. And that doesn't seem to make a difference in explaining the preferences for male suitors. Limitations include its accrued measure, relies only on one platform, it's representative of a certain type of Indian, and it was also conducted during COVID. But very quickly, to summarize the key bullets from the paper, is that there is a sizable penalty in the marriage market for women who express an interest in pursuing a career after work. So women who have never worked can expect to get almost 25% more of an interest compared to those who want to work after marriage. This is predominant in higher castes in the study, and I find that these preferences are largely driven by conservative gender norms. And in future research, I'm also looking at working with marriage websites to signal changes, to sort of create nudges or signals for men on these platforms. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Diva. So then our final talk will be from Douglas.
Thank you very much. Just get set up here. So let's see. Hopefully you can all see that. Thank you for hanging on to the bitter end for those of you who are still here. So the paper that I'm presenting today, this relates to the topic of recovery from lockdown. So employment recovery following lockdowns in 2020 in India, Peru, and Vietnam. So what we find when we look at research on high income countries is we tend to see a disproportionate effect of economic restrictions related to COVID-19 and lockdowns, disproportionately impacting upon women. So what tends to be put forward in terms of explanations for this, there's two general channels. The first of these relates to childcare. So this would be the argument that at times of stress, households and families will revert to more traditional gender roles, where more of the additional childcare responsibilities will push towards females in the household. Alternatively, another explanation for slower recovery among females would be that essentially women were doing slightly different jobs prior to the pandemic. So the argument here would be along the lines that women are more likely to be involved in these, what are sometimes referred to as contact intensive sectors. So this would be hospitality or retail or this type of thing. So the aim of this paper, really what we want to do is we want to see essentially whether there is this gender divide, which is coming up in low income countries, low and middle income countries. And we want to see precisely what is the change in the gender employment gap. So what I mean by that is what is the change in the probability of being employed for females relative to males at any given point in time. And we do this looking at a sample from Peru and Vietnam, and also two states in India, so Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. All of these countries had national lockdowns during 2020. Following that, we also want to try and decompose this change. So we kind of want to look at, do these channels that are commonly put forward in high income countries, is it the same channels working in this setting? So really this is a decomposition exercise of this change in the gender employment gap. So what we find, first of all, we do find that there is a significant increase in the gender employment gap in all countries. And perhaps more worryingly, we find that this is also a widening gap. So we look at it at 2 points in time following the lockdowns, and it's increasing in all of the countries. So we have an increase by the end of 2020 of, well, it says on the slide, so 19 percentage points in India, 18.6 in Peru, and still a substantial increase in Vietnam of 8.3 percentage points in the difference in employment between males and females. So looking at the potential channels, we find we're able to explain, I suppose, between 10 and 12% of this change in the gender employment gap in Peru and Vietnam through differences in caring responsibilities prior to the outbreak of COVID taking place, slightly less so in India. Surprisingly, we find little evidence that the type of work that men and women are doing prior to the lockdowns is what's driving this slower female recovery. So this is quite an unusual finding compared to the high income countries. So we use data from the Young Lives Longitudinal Study. So for those of you who aren't aware of the study, this particular study has been looking at collecting data on 12,000 children since 2002, so about 20 years now, in India, Peru, Vietnam, and Ethiopia. So in 2020, the study is based on two age cohorts. In 2020, they were aged 18 and 19 and 25 and 26 years old. So we're looking at adolescents or young people primarily. We look at data from a 5-part phone survey, which was implemented in 2020 and 2021. Obviously, in this case, face-to-face surveys were out of the question. So this 5-part phone survey contacted all of the original respondents and asked questions on their experiences of the pandemic, including employment. So we use this data to create a 4-wave panel based on employment status of individuals in particular periods of time. So we have a pre-lockdown period, so this January, February 2020. We have the period during lockdown, which is country specific. So India and Peru had very long, protracted lockdowns. In contrast, Vietnam had quite a short period of national lockdown in 2020. And then we have the around the interview dates, whether people were employed in August, October 2020 or November, December of the same year. So we restrict the sample to those who were employed prior to the pandemic. And we also restrict the sample in that we admit anybody who's in full-time education. So we really want to get at the group of people who in an alternative world where we didn't have this COVID experience, they would have been in work. We'd expected to see them working. So to give you an idea of what the employment trajectories were relative to pre-pandemic, this is the case on the slide there for India. So what we have, if you can look at the horizontal line at the top of the figure there, the horizontal line represents pre-pandemic employment levels. Now, by definition of our sample, everybody was working in wave 1. So what we look at on the y-axis is how the proportion of those employed for males and females differs away from this pre-pandemic level. So hopefully you can see in the first reference period, national lockdown, there's a larger hit towards males in India than there is towards females. So we have around about a 40 percentage point drop in the probability of being in work for males. However, you'll also see that the picture completely turns around and reverses by the end of the year. So both groups are hit early on, but males recover infinitely faster than females do. It's very clear that there's very little recovery in terms of female employment by the end of 2020. And you'll see at the end of the graph there, we're now starting to see this gender employment gap opening up quite dramatically by the end of the year. So switching to Peru now, you'll see there's a different pattern emerging, but it's the same outcome. So initially in Peru, we have a very significant impact on employment for both genders. So around about 60 percentage point drop in employment for both males and females. But again, we end up at the same result because men appear to recover much more quickly than women do. So by the end of the year, we're again seeing this disparity opening up. So in the case of Vietnam, you could say it's possibly following the same pattern. It's slightly less clear. There's certainly not as much of a clear advantage for men, but if anything, you're starting to see a bit of a gender gap opening up by the end of the year again. So this is really what we want to look at more formally in the empirical strategy, which I'm going to go through in a second. So before I go through that, aside from estimating the gender employment gap, we also want to get at this idea of what may be driving it. So I'm going to take you through the two mediators that we look at. So the first one on the slide there, I have a binary indicator called cares for others. So this takes the value of 1 if we have somebody who pre-pandemic was taking care of somebody in the household. So generally this was children, but it could also be old people or disabled people within the household that they had a caring responsibility for. So looking at the graph there, you can see you know, somewhat unsurprisingly, sadly, these types of responsibilities are very, very heavily weighted towards women in the sample, particularly in the 2 Asian countries. You can see that young women prior to the pandemic, before any school closures or anything else, are already taking up the larger, by far the larger share of these responsibilities. The second mediator that I want to talk about is this impacted job variable. So again, this is a binary indicator. And this takes the value of 1 if our respondent was working in a particular work activity pre-pandemic, which was especially hard hit by job losses following the implementation of the lockdowns. So what we do here is we separate our individuals according to the ISIC codes for the work activities that they were doing. And we look at these work activities and we see what proportion of them were losing jobs in the sample between our pre-pandemic wave and the lockdown. And we essentially pick the top 3 who were most hardest hit as being our impacted jobs. And it varies slightly between countries. Generally, these are what you would expect. So it's these, you know, it's retail and wholesale trade, it's hospitality, it's accommodation. In India, it also encompasses the more informal services. So these kind of face-to-face jobs, which you would expect to be very badly affected. So to look at this gender gap, first of all, a little bit more formally. First of all, what we do is we drop the second wave of the panel data. So we're not specifically interested in who loses their job during lockdown. What we're more interested in is the paths of recovery. It's also an issue for us that we can't really compare the lockdown reference period because it differs between the different countries. So we trim our sample down to a 3-wave panel. In equation 1, on the left-hand side, we have a binary indicator of whether somebody was in work. So individual I was in work at time t. The alpha term is an individual fixed effect. We then have this term with the omega, which represents the change relative to pre-COVID employment levels in general for the base category, which in this case is males, in wave 3 or wave 4. But primarily what we're interested in here is this delta term. So this tells you the difference in the probability of being in work between males and females in either wave 3 or wave 4. So these two post-lockdown waves. There's also a number of controls we have in there in the XI vector of controls there relating to education and location and employment, self-employment. So I'm going to refer to this delta term as the change in the gender employment gap or the total effect. What we also want to do is we want to try and decompose this total effect into what we can attribute to our two potential mediators. So as a start to doing this, we estimate what's known as the average controlled direct effect. And what this does is it essentially seeks to estimate the effect of being female on employment while shutting off any possible channels operating through either differences in caring responsibilities or differences in the type of employment which people were doing pre-lockdown. So in order to do this, we do this in 2 stages. We first start by augmenting our model with a single mediator variable. So this could be either of the 2 mediators. In fact, we run a specification with both mediators. So we're controlling for the effect of our mediator on work status. In equation 2, we then generate a demediated outcome. So this is the fitted value from 2, where we set this mediator variable equal to 0. So we're artificially setting the effect of the mediator equal for everybody across the sample, whether they're male or female. And then we can get at what's left over, which is essentially the ACD, the average controlled direct effect. And we do this, so we estimate this in equation 3 by simply plugging in this work tilde, this fitted value, into the first equation that we ran. This delta tilde term is the average controlled direct effect. So you can think of this as the residual effect of female on work status once we've shut off these different mechanisms through which female can impact your work status at a given period of time. Now this might be interesting in itself, but what we're really interested in is the difference. So we want to look at the difference between the total effect and the average controlled direct effect, because what we think this is measuring is the effect of the mediator on our outcome. And we express this as the percent of the total effect that we can explain through our mediator variable. So for the first set of results, to show you how this works, this is the first post-lockdown wave. So this is wave 3. At the top of each of the panels, you can see this is the estimated delta. So this is the total effect. So for example, we have a 9.6 percentage point increase in the gap in India, 16.4 percentage point increase in Peru, and around 6% increase in Vietnam. This is the total effect in each of the panels as well. And really what we're interested in is how this total effect differs from the average controlled direct effect when we hold the mediator on the left-hand side of the slide fixed. If we find a big difference in the effect, this is an indication that that mediator is a strong channel in predicting the total effect or the total change in the gender employment gap. So looking at cares for others, so this is pre-lockdown caring responsibilities, you can see that it explains very little of the change in the gender employment gap in India, but actually quite a substantial proportion. So around a quarter of the gap, or more than a quarter of the gap in Vietnam. Although you should note that it's a much smaller change in the gender employment gap in Vietnam than it is in India. Contrasting that, if we look at impacted job, you'll see that in the case of India and Vietnam, we actually have an average controlled direct effect, which is larger than the total effect. So to explain what that means, what that actually implies is that we have being in an impacted job is more of a mediating factor for young men than it is for young women. And I'm just apologizing, I'm actually going to skip back because I missed something that I meant to mention. If you look at impacted job in the description of the variables, you'll see that in fact, we do have more men working in these impacted jobs than we do women in all countries, and significantly so in Peru and India. So this is directly in contrast to what we find in high income countries. In fact, it's men who are more likely to be in these high contact, high intensive, face-to-face jobs. prior to the pandemic. And so from both mediators, you can see that in general, we're not explaining a whole lot, perhaps with the exception of Vietnam, we'll explain coming on for about 20% of the change. So looking at the final change, moving towards the end of the year, things start to become a little bit more similar across the three countries. So you can see, first of all, at the top of each of the panels, that gender employment gap has increased substantially, again, in all of the three countries. So we're up coming towards 20 percentage points increase in India and Peru, and a substantial increase in Vietnam. In terms of differences in caring responsibilities, we can explain an important percentage of it, but not a huge percentage, I would say, particularly in the case of India. And with impacted jobs, again, we're in a situation where we explain a negligible amount, or alternatively, we're explaining the gender difference between male and female employment as opposed to female and male employment. Overall, I think it's worth mentioning that using these two very important channels, or have been claimed to be very important channels, we're only able to explain around 10% of the increase in the gender employment gap in Peru and Vietnam, and even less than India. So there's a lot that remains unaccounted for. So summarizing and summing up now, so we find that there is a substantial increase in the gender employment gap. More concerningly, we find that this gap is widening. An early analysis of the data we collected in 2021 shows this is far from a story where this is a temporary change. It seems to be, if anything, it's increasing, or it's certainly not snapping back to what it was pre-pandemic. So the caring responsibilities channel, it explains a meaningful proportion of this. It certainly doesn't explain as much as you would expect. I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a second. But one of the interesting findings here is that the type of work that people are doing, it really doesn't explain this as much as it does in high income economies. It doesn't seem to be the channel through which this is working in these three very diverse countries, low and middle income countries. So of course, the question everyone's thinking, if it isn't these channels, what else is going to be going on? What's actually in play here that we're not measuring? So as much as we can get at this, we've uncovered a couple of possibilities. So one thing that we found is very interesting. When you look at those who didn't have caring responsibilities in the pre-pandemic wave, men and women, we find that those who then take on responsibilities after the advent of COVID are predominantly women. So these are new caring responsibilities that are coming into play that we're not necessarily picking up in our data. So obviously, it's hard to talk about the direction of causality between job losses and taking on new caring responsibilities, but I think it's quite suggestive in the fact that we're seeing this large rise in what women are doing in the household. And it may be an indication that we're underestimating the importance of this channel. Another thing that we found is we found that there may be differences in flexibility to take up new work between males and females. So what we tend to find is that that men, when they lose their work, they're more likely to find work, and it may not be with the same employer, or it may not even be in the same sector, and they also seem to be more able to migrate for work to different areas. And this is over and above any restrictions related to childcare or caring responsibilities within the home, which may restrict you to a particular job. So this is over and above that. So we may be touching on perhaps cultural or particular job market characteristics that make it easier for men to then switch into something new in the advent of losing their job. So I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you found the paper interesting, and I look forward to any comments or questions at the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you, Douglas. So that brings us to the end of the formal presentations, and hopefully it gives us some time now to ask some questions to the speakers. There are a couple in the chat, but I believe first Andrew had a question. Yes, for Pierre, if you'd be up to doing that now, Andrew.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak before any of the other participants. I wasn't expecting that, but thank you. I guess, Pierre, my question was about what it means for your survey to be nationally representative. So it sounds like you piggybacked on an old survey where I'm guessing you had people's phone numbers, and then you did another survey which was random digit dialing. So I'm just trying to think about how you put those two together and then called this the survey that you're going to that you then used for your paper. And I say this as someone who was involved in a telephone survey during COVID, so I know the difficulties of doing that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. Those are a great question, great clarification. So basically this survey was part of a broad set of like World Bank led initiatives to conduct phone surveys during the pandemic in a lot of different countries, and they followed the same pattern everywhere. Basically, they drew on the most recent nationally representative household survey in the country. In Kenya's case, this was a 2016 household survey, and as you mentioned, they focused on all those that had phone numbers and attempted to contact all those households. And then in the case of Kenya, in addition to contacting all those households with phone numbers from that previously nationally representative survey, they then augmented it with additional sample of random digit dialing, which makes up about 20% of the sample in this case, whereas 80% is from that initial sample of nationally representative households. And they do some analyses of how the set of households that they were able to contact from that baseline 2016 nationally representative sample compares to the general set of households. And they do look a little bit different, particularly in terms of like indicators of wealth. They're a little bit higher in terms of socioeconomic status, which makes sense of people who've had a phone number and it's been consistent over this time period. A lot of people are changing their phone numbers over time in Kenya, a lot of other African countries. So they look a little bit different from the rest of the sample. And so we should bear that caveat in mind in terms of interpreting any of the results of my analysis, is that it's as close to nationally representative as we can get with phone surveys, but it's going to be omitting the share of households that don't have phones, and maybe some of those households that maybe do, but are changing those over time.
I might throw it then to Diva, who has a question.
Took me so long to unmute. I had a question for Pierre as well, and since we can't use the Q&A, I thought I'd just ask him directly. Pierre, do you actually have also data on the gender of the siblings, so of the children in the household, and do you see any differences by gender, for example, of unpaid sibling care? For example, there's an older sister versus a brother.
Yeah, I do have gender data on the sex of all the household children. Unfortunately, the data on the children's childcare, like how much each individual child is contributing to childcare, is not available until after school is fully reopened. So it doesn't exist for the period that I'm most interested in. So I can't look at what's specifically changing for those individuals that are going back to school. But we did look at it for the period where we have the data for all the children. And of those like 15 to 20 hours per week of childcare that are provided by siblings, it's mostly being provided by female children, girl children.
Awesome. We had a question from the audience from Catherine Porter, who I'm going to invite to ask their question now if they would like to, and hopefully Marta will be able to unmute them for us.
Oh, hi. Yeah, can you hear me? Great. Yeah. I had two questions, one for Pierre and one for Diva. For Pierre, I was asking, about, I thought it was really interesting, the results about agriculture. And in a way I was thinking, well, that is the one thing when parents are working on their own farm, they can take the kids with them and kind of babysit whilst working. So I thought about, are they reporting it as childcare, but actually are they working at the same time? So in terms of the sort of measurement of multiple activities. And then, it was just the second question I had was, regarding the sort of the costs of this lost labor, and sort of putting together the pieces that you had been saying about the children actually working on the farm. And then in the end, I don't think you'll have it in your survey now, but maybe in a follow-up, looking at the productivity effect of this sort of slight substitution into children and out of parents, etc. So what is the short-term economic cost for farm households, even if labor looks like it's going down? Is there a cost? So that was my question to Pierre. And to Diva, I was reflecting on the depressing findings and just wondering how representative this is with regard to sort of the people who go on these matching websites. Are they more or less conservative? So are these an underestimate? And I was thinking about other research on education being up to a point something that improved your chances of getting a relatively good match on the marriage market, but not too much education, otherwise you'll be one of those overeducated lawyers that nobody wants to marry, and whether you could tease anything at all out between your two wage weights about the education. Thank you both, and thanks to everyone else about interesting presentations.
So maybe I'll answer first. Thanks, Catherine, for those questions. And they hit a lot on some of the things that we're interested in pursuing in terms of like building on this research is really what's going on with household agriculture, where, as you mentioned, it's very common in this setting to care for your kids on the household farm. You bring your kids to the plot with you, and they're either there, they're playing, or they're actively helping you with your farm production activities. Maybe they're weeding, maybe they're helping scare away birds, whatever it might be. Children of even pretty young ages are able to contribute to household agriculture. So in that case, you could think about these school closures having potentially been beneficial to some of these households in terms of like greater access to children's labor than they would have expected otherwise. Of course, I don't want to think about that as necessarily beneficial in the long term, because obviously those children are missing out on school and other sorts of things. And it may not be for the best for them. They might not prefer to be participating in household labor, but it's something that we're really interested in, is looking at, for example, does women's greater role in household childcare mean that they're more frequently taking children with them to the farm when they're responsible for them? And does that have implications for women's agricultural productivity relative to men? How does that play out? The data that we have doesn't have very good data on agricultural production. It has basically labor hours and some indicators of whether agricultural production increased or decreased relative to before the pandemic, but not much more detailed than that. But it's definitely something that we want to keep looking at and digging into. So thank you.
And thanks, Catherine, also for the questions on the paper. So I think there's a general issue of representativeness of my sample, just because the matrimonial website is limited to urban educated Indians to a larger extent, and I don't think it's reflective of the broader population. So I think that's just one of the realities of the experiment. The other finding is, of course, that I can only comment on how much sort of their responses and gender norms play a role in work, because I'm not varying education within the profiles that I actually have in this experiment, but future work to come on that. So I think it's potentially quite interesting for two reasons to look at work. There actually is a growing number of heterogamous marriages where men are marrying women who are more educated than them. And I think if you look at Riddhi Kashyap at Oxford, like she actually maps this trend in India. But I think what is more interesting is, looking at sort of, are you marrying women who have more education than you, who are in STEM or non-STEM compared to what you are working in? And I think those, disentangling some of that in the future will be more interesting as well.
Thank you both. I realize I'm nodding a lot, but you can't see me, but thanks.
One of the many hazards of Zoom. Pierre, did you have something?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions for Douglas. Thanks for your presentation. That was really interesting. One thing that came to my mind is, are you able to like control for the marital status of these individuals? I realize that they're relatively young, but there may be some differences. I would expect at these ages, maybe women are more likely to be married than men. And so maybe they're living in a 2-income household, or more incomes than that, depending on the household structure in this setting, whereas men maybe are relying solely on their own income, and that could affect incentives for how quickly you get back into the labor market and so on, if you have a backup income source. And then I was also curious about how you set up controlling for the mediator. It seems very likely that the mediator is going to have different impacts on labor participation for women and for men. So the way you control for it is you're controlling for the average effects across women and men, but I would expect those to maybe be different. So for example, the care responsibilities might have more of an impact on women's labor participation than for men, and you're controlling for the average, but not maybe those heterogeneous impacts. And so I wonder if that's really truly capturing the full effect of those different mediators if you don't introduce it interacted with the sex of the individual, and whether you've thought about that.
Fantastic. No, very good comments, definitely. No, we did have a look at the marital status. There are a few. I think there are a few who are married, particularly in the older cohort, and we could certainly look at that, definitely. What data we have, I'm not 100% sure. We might be able to update it with some of the more recent stuff we have and take a look at that, because you're absolutely right. If you're in that situation, then you're probably going to be, you know, you're going to be in a situation where you have more than one income coming in. So on the second question, are you referring to, you think there may be heterogeneity in the effects of the mediator within the different gender groups, or between the two different gender groups?
Between the gender groups.
So we think the mediator may be impacting in different ways. I see what you mean. So yes, that's certainly something we could look at. I mean, we could do some kind of decomposition into it and try and see, you know, whether it's the change, or the change in the effect, or the change in the level, whether there's differences. Yeah, that's a very good suggestion, and I'll certainly take that on board and have a look at that in the next iteration of the paper. Thank you.
Awesome. I think Tia had the next question.
Yeah, I think I was just, you know, also just going to ask Douglas, I was quite curious about the findings around men being present in more of the economic sectors that were affected by the pandemic versus not. And again, sort of just wondering how representative that was. Because, you know, the ILO's data has been showing that women are actually in sectors like hospitality, trade, retail, and so on, that were actually more, and so more worse affected. And this sort of seems to be different from their broader findings. So just curious in terms of how your sample, maybe because it's younger and so on, reflects that.
I think you've hit the nail on the head there. Yeah, we were surprised to find this as well. I think it may be a case of the age of the sample. So there's different types of jobs that people are going to be doing at a younger age relative to an older age. I'm guessing that the surveys you're talking about will probably be looking at working age adults right up to, I don't know, either 65 or maybe, I don't know what the age limit is anyway, but yeah, that's probably what's going on there. I will say on the definition of the impacted jobs, so we looked at various different interpretations of this. So we also ran robustness checks using services as a definition of impacted jobs. So just in services, we ran what else we did? Yeah, we ran a definition where we based impacted jobs on your ability to work from home. So these were the kind of the more IT intensive jobs would be less impacted, and we found it was remarkably robust. So my intuition, and my not based on anything guessed, is that this may be related to the age, particularly as we see it across the different countries as well.
Awesome. Louise?
So I have a quick question for Douglas. Previously, the young age panel surveyed the children, who are in effect young adults now, and their parents. Are you still surveying their parents? And if so, could you show the change between the children and the parents? And on Diva's point about you know, this business about who's in what occupation and which ones are women's occupation is very context specific. I remember the first time I looked at the data for Egypt, and I found out that men were in the garment industry and they were in hospitality in way bigger proportions than they were in sub-Saharan Africa, for example. So my guess is that this question of what industries are female dominated differs a lot, and it maybe you wish to control for that in your work, which ones are female dominated in the different countries.
Absolutely, yeah. So we're working with the kind of the work activities rather than the sectors. So we're trying not to define it specifically as sectors, because you will have, within every sector, you're going to have managerial roles, you're going to have you know, in garments industry, you're going to have people who are running the floor, who are actually making the garments. You're going to have management, you have different people doing different things. So we tried to get away from that. We can certainly have a look at different controls in terms of the different sectors that people are working in, and see if there's any differences there or any heterogeneity coming out in that. I think in terms of the parents. We do have, I mean, the great advantage of the data is that we have this information from a long time ago. So we have data of what their parents were doing in some cases at very similar ages. And that's certainly something we could bring into play. I mean, we are doing other work now on kind of aspirations relative to parents and whether the parents were, they were in particularly high-flying careers and whether that's going to change their, their aspirations to do better, to keep their jobs, their resilience, these types of things. And that's certainly something we could bring in. I will say it's a little bit more limited. So the older that they got, the more we focused on them as opposed to their parents. But the information is there, and it's absolutely valid in terms of bringing that in. We could certainly look into that, and thank you for the suggestion.
I might ask a question of Louis, then, as we seem to have slowed down. And anybody who has questions, please continue to add them to the Q&A. Louise, you sort of raised the importance of structural change in sub-Saharan Africa with respect to youth populations, and you touched on changes in the types of work in which households are engaging, particularly sort of a pivot from agriculture to other forms of off-farm work, whether that's, say, laboring on another's farm or generically moving to service sector or elsewhere. Can you tell me more about what you think the implications of the transition towards pluri-activity would have on intra-household dynamics, to inequality, and some of the other topics raised in this panel?
Okay, now I'm unmuting. In terms of pluri-activity, what we find is that households first of all, those are data on individuals, not households. And household pluri-activity is much more common. In other words, one member in agriculture, one in non-agriculture than individual. What we find is that individual pluri-activity tends to increase and then decline. So after you get to a certain income level, farming, the risk-reward relationship has improved enough that people, and water management comes in, et cetera, et cetera. So people tend to farm pretty much full-time. And so you'll find that in countries like Ghana, for example, whereas in a country like Ethiopia, where there's not good water management and there's still poor, even though agricultural productivity has increased, you're going to find a lot more pluri-activity among individuals. Now, so what does all that have to do with other topics on the panel? Well, I surely can't speak to the marriage market, but one of the things that we see is that, but it's not, it's not as stark as some people have drawn it out, but as countries become more urbanized, it becomes harder for women to work part-time and look after the kids. And at the same time, the household's smaller, so there's less likely to be an older child to look after the kids. So you do tend to see more labor force withdrawal there. So that's, quite important, and that's where some of the issues about school and childcare, et cetera, pop in. In terms of inequality, that's a complicated question, whether you mean household inequality of income or individual earnings inequality. The two could be quite different, as you know very well. What we know is that the difference in labor productivity among, say, the 10 broad sectors, not just 3, definitely widens initially during a structural transformation period, and then it declines as basically what you get to as you approach the so-called Lewis turning point, right? So, and to the extent that people are paid their marginal product, which in agriculture they don't seem to be, they seem to be paid below it. Or at least they earn below it, that would mean that inequality would widen as well. But we, inequality in earnings and structural transformation really varies a lot among countries, depending on also your starting position. So it's a bit complicated. Certainly, I think that's basically what I have to say and answer. But if there are more specific questions or things, hypotheses you had, you could speak up.
No, that's fantastic. Thank you. One more question I had for Pierre was just with reference to the different grades and the impacts of different COVID policies being differential between grades. Is there a reason that in particular, say 4th grade and 8th grade was selected? And does that have any implications for your design?
Yeah, that's a great question. Students in 8th and 12th grade were invited back because they were taking national exams. So 8th grade is the end of primary school, 12th grade end of secondary school. So they were all invited back for early preparation, a shorter gap before their big national exams. It's not clear why 4th grade was lumped in as well. There's nothing that seems to differentiate 4th grade from any of the adjacent grades, but it's a nice interval for 8, 12, I guess, maybe had something to do with it. Otherwise there's not anything that seems to be distinguishing those children. We dropped the children in grade 12, but we test sensitivity of our analysis to including them, and it doesn't change very much. Actually, some of the estimated coefficients drop a little bit, which makes sense because those 12th grade children are probably having slightly different effects than grade 4 or 8 children. And then we test sensitivity to not including any secondary school students in the control sample, and everything looks fairly similar along those dimensions as well.
Glad to hear. I might have one final question for Diva then, and then unless there are any further questions from the audience, I will let everybody go and enjoy their evenings. Diva, my question to you was just, what do you think the dynamics of the importance of the gender norm channel will be over time? You said, for example, that younger men tend to have less, relatively weaker treatment effects of being, I cannot read my own note. Younger men tend to be less impacted by the impact of their caste and so on and so forth. Do you think that has implications for the way in which we think about the dynamics of the import of caste on marriage decision making?
I think future trends are going to be very interesting. And the reason I say this is because India is one of the few countries in which gender norms are regressing. So between the last 2 rounds of the World Values Survey, you actually see a sort of, basically more conservatism arising when it comes to things around women's work and gender equality in general. And the 3rd World Values Survey is actually going to get released this year. It got held back due to COVID, and just to see sort of what they find in terms of, exactly these kinds of questions on where do you see these differences in gender norms arising? What do the patterns look like for younger versus older men? But yeah, I think in my study, what I do find is that the younger you are, and obviously that's within a range because it's not like you have 65 plus people in the sample. They tend to be a little bit more open to women who work. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. And with that, I started seeing any more questions, so it's about time to conclude the session. The last thing to say is that throughout this conference, there is always the Gather Town link open to people to engage with panelists and to keep this conversation going. So please feel free to jump over there after the session or at any point over the coming days. Thank you to all the panelists and for everybody who came. It's lovely to see you all.